So hello, Joseph.
Hello, Britt.
It's good to see you, and I appreciate you taking the time to do this interview. I'm off camera, and you're on camera, but people who will see this recording can hear my voice.
Absolutely.
And I should, I guess, for the record, state my name, Britt Earhart, and I'm the United Church minister at Salisbury United Church. But you're also my stepdad. And we've had lots of conversations over the years here and there about your time at Akaitcho Hall in the Northwest Territories, but we've never actually sat down to do any kind of an interview. So I thought this year, maybe we could risk it and see how it goes, and record it. And then you can share some of your experiences, both at the school, but also with Indigenous teachings and culture and ways that they may have influenced you over the years. So, sure. Okay, I'm going to give you a feather as we start. Symbols are important, and that's a feather for truth. So I just want to start right at the beginning. You were born at London, England. In London, England, yeah. And I just wonder more about where you were born in London and what you went to school there, what that was like. I understood you'd had some church involvement there. So just tell us a bit about what your first years were like in London.
I was born in St. Stephen's Hospital, which was within the sound of both bells. So I'm actually a true Cockney. I've lost most of my accent over the last 64 years that I've been in Canada, quite a while. But we lived in Fulham, which is also part of London. But then we moved to Kingston upon Thames, Surrey. My grandparents also lived in Kingston as well. So that's where basically I went to school. I went to Richmond Road Secondary, or actually elementary and secondary. When I was in the elementary, they came and they were looking, the church was looking, we're not a church-going group, but or a family, but they were looking for sopranos for the choir.
This was the Church of England?
This is the Church of England, which was the main big church in the center of Kingston in actuality. So they took me on, and we used to sing because we needed to practice and stuff. But while we weren't singing, we were just basically sitting in those kind of pews at the front, reading comics and stuff like that till it was our turn. So I wasn't a really good student. However, I did get paid a few shillings every, I think it was 3 months or something. So in a way, it was my first job as an elementary student. However, yes. You
ended up moving to the Northwest Territories when you were 14.
Yes.
And my first thought about that was, what a change from London.
Absolutely.
And the heart of London, of the heart of Cockney London, to the Northwest Territories. And my question would be, wasn't that a bit of a shock to you, that transition?
Yes. But really, when I knew we were going to move, there were in England books called Buffalo Bill books. They were actually about Indigenous people, mainly from the States, like the Sioux and that kind of thing. But they told you all about the dress, the regalia. They told you about moccasins and that kind of thing.
You had this idea of what it would be like.
I had this vision in my mind of what it was going to be like. And when I met my first Indigenous person, it was cold, a cold day, because it was in the spring, and everybody was wearing parkas. And here he was wearing a parka. He looked like everybody else. He spoke English just like everybody else. I was really totally disappointed at that point. I thought we'd get into some sign language or some kind of stuff, but a lot of...
So you were looking forward to going. You got there with you came after your dad had come, and did your mom go with you then at that point?
Yes, there was, like, my older brother got left there. I was supposed to be left there, but I had
You weren't going to be left behind.
No, I wasn't. I'm pretty stubborn sometimes. So no, I goofed off my last year. I got a scholarship, 13 plus, and I was going to a technical school. I'd have ended up as a draftsman or an engineer or something. But because I'd goofed off and I almost knew I was going to Canada, I kicked up such a stink, they pretty much let me had to let me come. So yes, that was the way it worked out.
So you really wanted to be here.
Yes, I did.
So you came to
Running
Canada,
around
spent a year.
running around in the bush. I had a wonderful time. There was nobody my age. They were either men or kids.
Okay.
I was, 14, coming on 15. There was nobody really my age, but I didn't care about that. I just loved the bush. I wanted to be a game warden. But my dad had said in the fall, "Oh, Joe, I've got you something." I thought he was talking about correspondence. No, he wasn't. He was actually talking about a job. I actually had a job in the kitchen as a flunky, and I worked longer hours than my dad, from 6:30 in the morning till 6 at night.
Wow.
But when I went to school, I had $1,500 in the bank, which is equivalent money to probably over $10,000 now. It got me into a lot of trouble.
I'm sure it did. So your dad got you this job,
Yeah.
and then how did you end up at the residential school?
The next year, they built Akaitcho Hall and Sir John Franklin School. They were brand new schools
In Yellowknife.
in Yellowknife, and because of the distance I lived from Yellowknife, which was like 68 miles, you could only get in by plane. In the wintertime, they had truck roads on the
Ice roads.
ice roads. But because of that distance and that, I was allowed to go. I was actually the first person. I arrived on their doorstep in September with my little suitcase, skinny little kid, and a skinny little white kid. And then they were really, really surprised because I didn't quite look right, I guess.
You were the first student in Akaitcho Hall ever. Wow. And Akaitcho Hall was a government run, no church involvement.
No church involvement. It was government run, and eventually it got moved over to the Northwest Territories from the government.
Okay.
Yeah, became the Northwest Territories run school. It was a combination. The school, that was the Akaitcho, was the dormitory. That was the residential part.
Yes.
The school itself was Sir John Franklin School. Akaitcho was actually an indigenous chief that became his guide, that took him to the Arctic.
Akaitcho was an indigenous guide for Sir John Franklin.
That's right.
And so the residence for the students who were there was Akaitcho, but they went to the school.
Yes.
Sir John Franklin School?
Yes, Sir John Franklin. And it was a combination because it was an industrial arts school, plus it was also a high school.
Okay, so were some of the students there also day schoolers?
The day schoolers actually came from town.
Okay.
So they were what we would call the townies.
Yes.
And some of them were indigenous, but most of them were Caucasian.
So so there's some quite a mixed population at the high school, but the residence is mostly indigenous.
Yes, mostly.
Do you remember your first impressions of the school, of how you were welcomed? Do you remember the arrival of the first indigenous students there?
Well, we were certainly welcome, but it was a brand new school. It was a big empty school. There was a cafeteria. There was an eating area. There was at the far end, there was a stage and another area where on Friday nights we used to have a dance. We used to have, and because I'd been in England, I think that the privileged thing that I had was I was very used to a monitor system, and that's the English system they actually had at the Akaitcho Hall. So they made me assistant head monitor. There were 4 people to a room. I had Victor. He was born in Old Crow, and he actually came from Inuvik. And there was also George and Johnny. They were Inuit, but they also came from Inuvik as well.
Okay.
And George had been, for example, I'm not so sure about Johnny, But George had been in residential school since he was about 5 years old.
Okay, so pretty well his whole
life.
whole life. He'd
Absolutely.
not been, that's a really long time.
Huge.
Yeah.
But people from Akaitcho actually came from all over. They came from as far south as Fort Smith, all the way up to the high Arctic,
Yeah.
and all the way east to over Quebec, and all the way west to Yukon.
Yeah, I don't.
And we had, like in Aklavik and Inuvik, there were 2 church schools that we got those kids from, but they were the ones that you hear the horror stories about if you spoke your own language, you got a good beating and that kind of thing. I didn't really hear anything about sexual abuse while talking to other students who had been there, but definitely there were a lot of beatings for your own language. The idea coming from Duncan Campbell Scott was that, who was in charge of Indian affairs from 1913 to about 32, I think. His idea, and he was an assimilationist, was that if you took away the language of the people, you would destroy their culture, and then you could easily assimilate them. And he said he could do that in 2 years. Of course, wait a minute, he's dead and gone, but we still have Indigenous people. They did not get assimilated. In fact, right now, if you look at colonialism, there are 4 different things of it, discovery, that kind of thing.
What were the 4? Name them again.
Discovery, invasion, extraction of resources, and the last one is assimilation.
Okay.
But
those are the 4 aims of colonialism.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, because since 1452, when the Pope told, I think it was Queen Anne, the Spanish Queen,
Yeah.
that it's okay, you can go anywhere in the world, and if they're not Catholics, you can pretty much do what you want with them.
That was the doctrine of discovery you're talking about.
That was the doctrine of discovery. 50 kind of varies there, but that's what started this colonial thing, people going all over the world and just putting their flag anywhere, basically, and saying, hey, I'm claiming this for England, or
for Spain or for France or for the Netherlands, or for
there's a big thing going on for that.
Portugal,
wherever. Yeah, absolutely.
Belgium.
Yeah, they're all in it. All the European countries.
Yeah, sure. Germany.
Yeah.
So this gathering of the young teens from all over the north happened at Akaitcho Hall.
Yeah.
And my sense from you is that you weren't segregated into like Indigenous people in one dorm.
No,
I
mean, there were boys and girls.
Yes.
Miss Fairfax was the girl supervisor.
Okay.
She was an old spinster, but she kind of liked me. I don't know why. Because I was very polite, I guess. Yes. Or maybe I was white. I don't know.
Yes.
But we had eventually had a guy named Mr. Radcliffe. He was our supervisor.
Okay.
Yeah. So no, there was no real separation that way. Like I said, I was in with 3 Indigenous guys, and we got along really well. We had a lot of fun together. And, also the dances, we had dances every once in a while. Sometimes we were learning square dancing, but sometimes in those days it was like, rock and roll had just come in, and we were jiving and doing that kind of thing as well. So, yeah.
So you had Indigenous roommates. You obviously shared a lot when you were getting ready for bed at night or lying in the dark or whatever. And they talked about their time in the residential school.
They didn't openly necessarily talk about it, but if you asked them, they would tell you. Yeah.
Yeah. And probably anyone who's been sexually abused is going to be fairly reticent anyway. I mean, that's a thing that you wouldn't just hear somebody normally talking about. So.
I was abused in England. I never told my parents anything about that, because I figured if I tell my parents, they're going to give me a beating.
Well, you don't know.
No, it was a common thing. my brother Gerald was up a tree, and I guess this guy in the coat and whatever said, "Hey, come on down and wrestle with me. I'll give you a shilling." And he was very eager to go, and I said, "No, you're not going to go there. This is one of these guys that was going to abuse you or whatever." So,
Well, children are very vulnerable.
They are vulnerable.
Yeah,
absolutely. Anyway.
So, one of the questions I wanted to ask was about privileges. One privilege you had was because you came from a British school system, they immediately saw you as compatible with the monitoring roles.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Were there other kinds of privileges that you could see came your way that maybe Indigenous students didn't?
The weird thing was I had a couple of 22s and a 303. I took the 22s to school.
Today that would not get you.
That'd get you charged.
Yeah.
But the thing was, you could give the bolt to the supervisor, so you couldn't use it.
Okay.
But on the weekend, you could ask back for the bolt, put it with your gun. You could go out, but you have to, of course, the rule is for 22, stay 1 mile away from town.
Yeah.
So me and another guy used to go out and shoot at each other, actually, which I shouldn't say. No. I'm a very good shot.
And the Inuit students got to go out shooting too. Did they have guns?
No, they didn't. I was one of the few.
In your thing. What happened to the classmates after Akaitcho Hall? Did you keep touching them? Did they go back to their communities? Did they rediscover their Indigenous culture? What happened?
Most of them would have gone back to their own communities, but I didn't, as I was going to say, I didn't realize until I was about 30 of the damage that was done, because you see, they were 10 months in their school,
away from their communities, hundreds or thousands of
miles, or thousands in some cases.
Thousands, and some of them stayed there all year round too.
Yes.
Okay.
And when they went back, of course, they'd already become disconnected. And a good example was one of my roommates. He was diagnosed with TB. He was sent down to the Charles Campbell Indian Hospital. He spent, I don't know, they usually spent a year or two there. And he's still in Edmonton. We've reconnected. He's a very good friend of mine. But his brother died. His brother was on the reconciliation committee, but I think he might have got cancer or something. He died last year.
Okay.
George went back for the funeral to Inuvik, but George couldn't relate to his own people. He couldn't speak the language. He'd been so far away from it for so many years that he, there's
a huge gap,
and when you've been in there since you're 5 years old, hello.
Yeah.
Of course, they're going to destroy your language. That was the initial thing up in Inuvik or Klavik, whichever one he was in. And then when you come to that school, I can absolutely see it.
Yeah.
I was going to say something about, I had another friend, he got TB. When I was at university in 1962, he actually had to go also to Charles Campbell. And then when I went back to Charles Campbell the second time, I said, "Hey, could I see, so-and-so artistry?" And they said, "Well, are you a relative or something?" I said, "No, I'm just a friend and I'm here at university and I knew he was here." And they said, "Oh man, he died. He had TB of the kidneys." Now, I didn't know you can get TB of anywhere. That's the one thing I really didn't know. I always thought TB was the lungs.
Do you know what happened to him after he died?
Honestly, don't know.
They didn't say he's been sent back home or buried somewhere? No. So did you ever wonder?
I think Charles Campbell had a graveyard, but I'm not sure. I never found out, and I wasn't, I thought I was kind of in shock when, walked back to the university because I was pretty much in shock, and I thought, oh my God.
Yeah. Yeah. You yourself have been diagnosed with TB exposure when you were up at Akaitcho Hall.
That's when we were all in the room together, and that's when George must have been in 60, they came and tested us, and I actually came up positive as well, because it's the thing that they do on your
Yeah,
arm.
I had one of those too. when I
But the
was-
nurse said, oh, he said, where are you from? And I said, well, I'm from London, England. And he said, oh, well, don't worry about you. You've been exposed, but you're not going to get it. That's what he told me.
But how did he know that?
I have no idea. The chances of me getting it were a lot slimmer, I would suspect, than an Indigenous person.
Perhaps.
Yes, I would say. For me.
So you did your university, at least I know you were in the Air Force briefly.
Yeah,
Then you went into teaching
yeah,
and you ended up teaching English,
yeah,
which is kind of ironic.
yeah. It's
And tell
kind
me
of
the
a
story about
revenge.
that.
Well, because when I went to high school in grade 10, my English teacher, a woman, who was, not because she's a woman, but she was very insensitive and had me reading something. Well, wait a minute, I'm a Cockney. You can't tell probably my accent right now because I've been here 62 years, but I had a very strong Cockney accent. So I was reading this passage and she said, no, I want you speaking in English. And I said, well, excuse me, but I am English and I can only speak English. So, you know, there you go.
But she didn't find your brand of English to be real English.
Not Canadian English by any measure of means, I
Yeah.
suppose.
And did she, I guess most of the students that were in residential school by then that had transferred from other places had already been kind of,
Yeah,
were already speaking English.
yeah.
Did she give anybody else a hard time or were you just
No,
the only
I
one?
was the only one. Of course, when you're 15 and you get embarrassed in front of your class, you know, you feel you're about that small.
Right. An English teacher.
And I became an English teacher.
And you were ironically, in spite of the fact, and do you think that you lost so much of your Cockney accent because it was emphasized to you that you should speak English differently?
I'm not sure. Honestly, I really don't know.
So you went on to do some teaching on different reserves as well.
Yeah, I lived on Blueberry Reserve for 4 years.
And you taught at Saddle Lake too.
I taught at Saddle Lake, and when I worked for Northern Lights up in the north in Lac La Biche, I was running a school that was called an off-campus, because basically the kids would come in and they were 99% Indigenous, and we had set them up with distance learning to actually start getting their grades, and that's what I was talking to you about.
So how did your exposure to Inuit, your Inuit peers in school, to the Northwest Territories and life there, to residential school, how has that all kind of affected the way that you look at the world? Has it had an influence on you?
Yes, because I think in Indigenous mythology, we're all here on Turtle Island. That means all of us. We're all humans. We may be different. We may be different colors. We may be different languages, but that really doesn't matter. Basically, we're all humans.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, it made me think much more, and I became much less sort of racial or prejudiced or stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, my not just my parents, but my grandfather was a real racist.
Mm-hmm.
What happened is that if there was an English territory, like in Africa, where there were a lot of East Indian people, when they got kicked out, they actually could immediately get a passport and come to England.
No, because they were part of the Commonwealth.
Because they were part of the Commonwealth, which was understandable.
Mm-hmm.
But man, he was really, really upset about that, you know. We call it racism today. But what I found is that, wait a minute, people they have the same desires, the same wants, the same needs, all of these things. It doesn't matter if you're in Timbuktu or you're some other place. They, you know, family is important, that kind of thing. For Indigenous people, family is very important, especially children,
Mm.
you know. And in a lot of Indigenous groups, children are, you know, they're the future.
Mhm.
And I think that's where it fitted in for me being an English teacher. You know, first class I had was down in Forestburg. I had 42 grade 9 kids. Didn't have a clue about what I was doing. However, they did invite me back to be the grade 12 speaker. And then they invited me back, I think it was at their 10-year university as well.
Mm.
So I must have been doing something right.
So kids were important. So
Very
then taking kids away is taking
Absolutely.
the heart out
You're
of the
gutting-
community.
You're gutting the thing. Yeah.
Mhm. Living on Mother Earth, and
Yeah.
why is that significant?
Well, for Indigenous people, land and their connection to the land is very, very important. And if you start looking at things, quite often you see that what non-Indigenous people or the colonial people have done is, you know, they've raped and pillaged the earth, really. I mean, we're in bad situations. Somebody told me that in the Pacific, there's an island, I think it was Tillman, there's an island that is as big as some huge country floating around made out of plastic.
Mhm.
You know, what are we absolutely doing? We're destroying, you know, Mother Earth, you know, and I feel very bad for the new generations, because you see what happened in our type of generation was you want your kids to have a better life than you had, but that's not going to necessarily be possible.
Mhm.
You know, we need to change a lot of things.
Mhm.
You know, and if you go back to the Bible, you go back to Christ rather than the Old Testament, which is very vindictive, etc. You realize that, wait a minute, we need to, you know, respect each other. We need to love each other. We need to work with each other, because if you look at nature, the way it works is this: you get two atoms and they join together. They become a molecule. Everything is, in a sense, expanding into something bigger and better. And the only way we can actually do that is if we all get together and if we all actually work together. Forget the religion, the race, and all of that stuff. It's rubbish. It's, you know, I was thinking, because it came to me when I was talking to you before, that there's that song, we have to be carefully taught. We have to be carefully taught how to hate. Yes, if you're a hateful person and have this thing in your heart, I can absolutely see that your kids are going to grow up like that. But that isn't necessarily the way we should be.
Mhm.
You know?
Mhm. Well,
For me, I'm so thankful that I went there, because it's given me a whole different perspective, I think, on humans, on people, all of that kind of stuff.
What would you say to Canadians who have had a hard time accepting that residential schools ever happened, or that if they happened, they were really more just like boarding schools? There was nothing particularly as bad about them as people say. What would you say to Canadians about that, or about the long-term impact of residential schools on Inuit and Indigenous people?
Well, number one, I would say check your history, because if you know Canadian history, you know absolutely the residential schools were very, very bad, in the sense of, yes, there were beatings, there was sexual stuff going on, all of that kind of thing. And I think the other thing that happened, you see, is if you were taken out of school at 5 years old, how did you ever learn to be a parent? You didn't. All you learned to be was what your teachers were doing to you, abusing you, and also beating you. So when you became a parent, what would you do to your kids? Exactly what you had been taught, in a way.
Most kids learn by modeling,
Modeling,
the
and that's
adults.
exactly what you do.
and you learn how to be a good human being by the
By doing
modeling
that.
of the adults
That's right.
and the older kids around you.
Yeah. But if you never see that, and all you have got is some vicious person
Right.
beating the crap out of you, excuse my language, but yeah,
And telling you can't speak your language and that
and you're not worth
and
anything.
that
You're not worth
your
anything.
culture is sinful and all of that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're wearing a ribbon shirt. Where did you get that from?
I actually got it from somebody. There was some Indigenous person started a group up in Fort Saskatchewan where I was working, because I was working at the museum there. And so I joined their group. But this person was not an Indigenous person that made this. They'd got a patent from somewhere. A ribbon shirt isn't something that I would normally wear. Although if I went to a powwow, yeah, I'd probably wear it.
Mhm.
And this hat was given to me almost 15 years ago. My daughter had gone to Texas. She's a nurse down there. And her name, of course, is Wood. And this person came up to her who was an Indigenous person from the Choctaw Nation and introduced himself as Wood. So, you know, they went for a coffee and had a little tete-a-tete type of thing. And he actually made it for me, and he actually beaded it for me as well.
Very nice.
Very nice.
Mhm.
And it's my special hat. And I've also got some badges on there from Kihu, I think it is a reserve. There's different reserves. I got Saddle Lake, I think, that kind of thing. And also the Choctaw, the Great Choctaw Nation, which is what he put on there, which I appreciate.
Mhm.
And then in return, what I did is I learned soapstone carving in, and so I made him a small little buffalo, which when my daughter came up here, I said, take this back. This is the guy's gift.
Mhm.
He wanted a buffalo.
Yeah, very
I said,
nice.
yeah.
So, thank you for the interview.
My pleasure.
Thank you for taking the time.
Absolutely.
And I just really appreciate your stories.
Thank you.
I'm sure we'll have other conversations about
Oh,
this
I'm
as
sure
time
we
goes
will.
by.
Yeah, and if anybody wants to ask me questions or anything like that, I'm more than willing to.
Okay.
I can only give my perspective, of course, but
Yes.
you know, because I'm Caucasian in an Indigenous setting, I kind of have maybe a different take on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you have an experience and you can speak to some things that
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
maybe it's part of the story too. So
Yeah.